The black dress hung in my closet like a shadow I couldn't escape. 3 weeks had passed since I'd worn it to bury my son, and yet I found myself staring at it every morning as if Denzel might somehow materialize from its folds and tell me this was all a terrible mistake. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I pressed my palm against the cool fabric, feeling the weight of everything that had collapsed since that phone call. Heart attack at 34. The words still felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. How does a mother prepare for outliving her child? How does she reconcile decades of worrying about scraped knees and broken hearts, only to have everything end with a stranger's voice on the telephone? The doorbell's sharp chime cut through my reverie. I smoothed down my worn sweater, the same one I'd been wearing for 3 days, and shuffled to the front door of the small apartment that had become my prison. Mrs. Catherine Mills. The young woman on my doorstep wore a crisp navy blazer and carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was professional, practiced, but there was something calculating in her eyes that made my spine straighten. Yes, I'm Jennifer Hayes from Hayes & Associates Legal Services. I represent Mills Construction, your former family business. She paused, letting the emphasis on former settle between us like a blade. May I come in? We have several documents that require your immediate attention. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mills Construction, the company Denzel and I had built from nothing, the business that bore our family name, was now sending lawyers to my door. But it wasn't our business anymore, was it? The moment they lowered Denzel's casket into the ground, Natalie had made that crystal clear. Of course, I stepped aside, noting how Jennifer's gaze swept over my modest living room, cataloging the hand-me-down furniture and faded photographs. I'd moved here after Natalie's ultimatum, taking only what fit in my Honda Civic. Everything else, the house Denzel bought me, the office where I'd managed accounts for 15 years, the life I'd carefully constructed, belonged to his widow now. Jennifer settled onto my threadbare couch and opened her portfolio with theatrical precision. Mrs. Mills, I'm here regarding the final dissolution of your partnership agreement with Mills Construction and several irregularities that have come to light in the company's financial records. My hands went cold. Irregularities? During the transition audit, we discovered several unauthorized expenditures traced back to your access codes, payments to personal accounts, transfers that don't align with approved business expenses. Jennifer's voice was steady, clinical. Mrs. Natalie Mills has authorized me to offer you a settlement agreement to resolve these matters quietly, without involving law enforcement. The room spun slightly. I gripped the arm of my chair, forcing myself to breathe. That's impossible. Denzel handled all major financial decisions. I only managed payroll and vendor payments. Nevertheless, the digital trail is quite clear. Jennifer slid a thick document across my coffee table. This agreement releases Mills Construction from any financial obligations to you, including the pension Denzel promised in exchange for your cooperation in this matter. I stared at the papers without reading them. The words blurred together, but the meaning was sharp enough. Natalie wasn't content with inheriting everything. She wanted to ensure I left with nothing, not even my dignity. Denzel promised me that pension after I spent 15 years building that business with him, I said quietly. It was supposed to be my security. Promises don't hold up in court, Mrs. Mills. Documentation does. Jennifer's smile never wavered. You have 72 hours to sign. After that, Mrs. Mills will have no choice but to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. After Jennifer left, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to understand how quickly a life could unravel. 3 weeks ago, I was Catherine Mills, co-founder of a successful construction company, living in a 4-bedroom house with a garden I'd tended for 8 years. I was Denzel's business partner and closest confidant, the woman who'd helped him navigate every major decision since Natalie entered his life. Now, I was a potential criminal, according to legal documents that painted me as a thief who'd stolen from her own son. The phone rang, startling me from my spiral of self-pity. Natalie's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in me, perhaps the last vestige of the woman who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms, made me answer. "Catherine," Natalie's voice was honey over razor wire. "I assume you met with Jennifer today?" "Yes." I kept my tone neutral, though my hands were shaking. "Good. I want you to understand, this isn't personal, it's business. Denzel left debts you couldn't possibly comprehend, and I have to protect what's left of our company." "Our company?" The words stung more than I'd expected. "Natalie, you know I never took money inappropriately. Denzel handled all major transactions. He must have." "Denzel is dead, Catherine." Her voice turned sharp, cutting. "He can't explain anything. But you were the one with access to those accounts, and you're the one who benefited from those transfers. The evidence speaks for itself." I closed my eyes, seeing Denzel's face in my mind. Not the pale, still version from the funeral, but the animated man who'd called me every morning to discuss the day's priorities. He'd been excited about something in those final weeks, secretive about meetings and phone calls. I'd assumed it was a surprise for Natalie's birthday. "If I don't sign," I asked, though I already knew the answer, "then you'll spend whatever years you have left fighting criminal charges you can't afford to defend." "Is that really what you want Denzel's mother to be remembered for?" The line went dead. I stared at the settlement papers spread across my coffee table, seeing my future laid out in legal terminology. Sign and admit to crimes I hadn't committed, in exchange for avoiding prison. Refuse, and watch Natalie destroy what remained of my reputation and freedom. Either way, I was finished. The next morning, I found myself standing in the employment office of Elite Domestic Services, clutching a newspaper clipping that promised high-paying positions for experienced household staff. The receptionist, a woman my age with kind eyes and practical shoes, looked over my application with growing concern. "Mrs. Mills, I have to ask, this gap in your employment history and your sudden departure from Mills Construction, are you sure you're ready for live-in domestic work? It's quite different from office management." I thought of my dwindling savings, the stack of bills on my kitchen counter, and the 72-hour deadline ticking away in my head. "I'm a good cook, and I've managed households before. I need the work." She nodded slowly, then pulled out a thick file. "We do have one position that might suit your situation. It's challenging, and the employer is quite particular, but it pays exceptionally well. Mr. Samuel Blackwood in the hills outside Santa Barbara. He's looking for a live-in cook and lighthouse keeper." The name meant nothing to me, but the salary figure she mentioned made my breath catch. In 6 months, I could earn enough to fight Natalie's charges, maybe even hire a lawyer to investigate those mysterious transfers Denzel had made. "What makes it challenging?" I asked. The receptionist's expression grew cautious. "Mr. Blackwood was injured in an accident several years ago. He's not an easy man to work for." The previous cook left rather suddenly, without much explanation, but he's requested someone mature, someone who won't be intimidated by his condition or his temperament. 3 hours later, I was driving my packed Honda up a winding mountain road, watching Santa Barbara shrink behind me. The Blackwood estate emerged gradually through the oak trees, a sprawling modernist structure of glass and steel that seemed to float above the valley. It was beautiful and cold, like an architectural magazine spread devoid of human warmth. Samuel Blackwood waited for me in his wheelchair on the main terrace, silhouetted against the evening sky. Even seated, I could see he'd once been a tall man. His shoulders were broad beneath an expensive sweater, and his dark hair was silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Sharp, intelligent, and completely unforgiving. "Mrs. Mills," his voice was cultured, controlled. "You're older than I expected." "I'm experienced," I replied, matching his directness, "and I need this job."
"House, Mrs. Jackson will show you to your quarters. Dinner is at 7 sharp. I eat simply but well, and I don't tolerate delays or excuses." My room was a small but elegant suite on the ground floor connected to the main house by a covered walkway. The furniture was expensive, the linens were Egyptian cotton, and the view of the valley was breathtaking. It was more luxurious than anywhere I'd lived since Denzel's death, and yet it felt like exile. I unpacked quickly, hanging the black dress in the spacious closet alongside my few other possessions. Everything I owned now fit in 2 suitcases, a life reduced to its bare essentials. Dinner preparation went smoothly. I'd always been a competent cook, and Samuel's preferences were straightforward. Fresh ingredients, simple preparations, elegant presentation. He ate in solitary silence while I cleaned the kitchen, our only interaction consisting of his brief nod of approval when I served the main course. By 10, the house was quiet. Samuel had retired to his suite, and Mrs. Jackson, the daytime housekeeper, had long since departed. I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring out at the lights of Santa Barbara twinkling far below. This was my life now. Cooking for a paralyzed stranger in exchange for enough money to fight my dead son's wife. It wasn't the future I'd imagined when I stood beside Denzel's grave, but it was survival. I was reaching for a glass of water when I noticed the drawer beneath the coffee station was slightly ajar. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that would normally escape notice, but something about the gap between the drawer front and the cabinet face nagged at me. Perhaps it was my years of managing construction details or simply the need to feel useful in my new environment, but I bent down to push it closed properly. The drawer stuck slightly, as if something inside was preventing it from shutting completely. Without thinking, I pulled it open to clear whatever was causing the obstruction. Inside, beneath a stack of kitchen towels and beside a collection of takeout menus, was a manila folder marked "Private" in bold black letters. I should have closed the drawer immediately, should have respected my employer's privacy and minded my own business, but something made me pause. Something about the folder's placement. Not hidden exactly, but tucked away with the casual secrecy of documents that weren't meant for public consumption, but weren't locked away either. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the towels and slid the folder toward me. It was thick, stuffed with papers and what looked like photographs. The ethical part of my mind screamed warnings about overstepping boundaries, about the job I desperately needed, about the trouble I could find myself in. But I was already opening the folder. The first thing I saw was a photograph, a publicity shot from a construction trade magazine. The headline read, "Mills Construction Wins Regional Safety Award." And there, smiling beside a gleaming excavator, was my son, Denzel. My breath stopped entirely. With shaking hands, I lifted the photograph to examine it more closely. Yes, it was definitely Denzel, wearing his good suit and the proud smile he always got when Mills Construction received recognition. But why would Samuel Blackwood, a man I'd never heard of until this morning, have this particular photo in his kitchen drawer? Beneath the photograph were more documents. Newspaper clippings, what looked like financial reports, and several pages of handwritten notes in precise angular script. I could make out fragments. Mills construction, expansion plans,
Catherine Mills, co-founder, and something that made my heart race. Denzel Mills, partnership opportunities. At the bottom of the folder, in a clear plastic sleeve, was another photograph. This one was different, personal, candid. It showed Denzel sitting across from someone at what looked like an upscale restaurant. Denzel was leaning forward, animated, gesturing with his hands the way he did when he was excited about a new project. I could only see the back of his companion's head, but something about the set of the shoulders, the expensive sweater, the perfectly styled silver hair sent a chill through me. The companion was Samuel Blackwood. My legs went weak. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to process what I was seeing. Denzel had known Samuel Blackwood. More than known him, they'd met, dined together, discussed business. The notes in the folder suggested they'd been exploring some kind of partnership or investment opportunity. But Denzel had never mentioned Samuel Blackwood to me. In 15 years of business partnership, through every major decision and contract discussion, Denzel had never spoken this man's name, which meant either Denzel had been keeping secrets from me in the weeks before his death, or I stared at the photograph again, studying Denzel's expression. He looked excited, hopeful, the way he got when he saw potential for growth, for opportunity, the way he'd looked in those final weeks when he'd been secretive about his meetings and phone calls. My hands moved without conscious direction, turning to the next page in the folder. What I found there made the room spin around me. It was a contract draft, marked with Denzel's handwriting and signature. The header read, Investment Partnership Agreement, Mills Construction and Blackwood Industries. The dollar amounts listed were staggering. Enough money to transform Mills Construction from a regional contractor into a major player. Enough money to explain the mysterious transfers that Natalie's lawyer had claimed were embezzlement. But if Denzel had been negotiating this partnership, if Samuel Blackwood had been preparing to invest in Mills Construction, why hadn't Denzel told me? Why had he kept this secret? And most importantly, why was I now standing in Samuel Blackwood's kitchen, cooking his meals and cleaning his house while he said nothing about knowing my dead son? The folder slipped from my numb fingers, scattering papers and photographs across the kitchen floor. As I knelt to gather them, one more document caught my eye. A letter handwritten on expensive stationery dated just 1 week before Denzel's death. Samuel, it began in Denzel's familiar handwriting, I need to tell Catherine the truth about our arrangement. She deserves to know what's coming, and she needs to understand why I've been moving funds to prepare for the partnership. I can't keep lying to her about the meetings, the financial preparations, everything. She's my business partner and my mother, and she's earned my honesty. I plan to tell her everything this weekend, including about you. The letter ended abruptly, as if Denzel had been interrupted mid-thought. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by scattered papers that told a story I couldn't quite piece together. Denzel had been secretly negotiating a business partnership with Samuel Blackwood. He'd been moving money, the same money that Natalie's lawyer now claimed I'd stolen. He'd planned to tell me everything the weekend he died, but he never gotten the chance. And now, 3 weeks after burying my son, I found myself trapped in the house of the man who held the key to clearing my name. A man who'd said nothing about knowing Denzel when he hired me, who'd watched me struggle and accepted my desperate need for work without revealing that he knew exactly who I was. I looked up from scattered papers to find Samuel Blackwood's wheelchair silhouetted in the kitchen doorway, his intelligent eyes fixed at me with an expression I couldn't read. I see you found my research files, he said quietly. The folder, the photographs, Denzel's letter, everything suddenly made terrible sense. But it also raised questions that made my chest tight with a mixture of hope and fury. Samuel Blackwood had known my son. He'd known about the partnership, about the money transfers, about everything that had led to my current nightmare. And he'd said nothing while I begged for this job. Nothing. While I fled to his house in desperation, Samuel Blackwood wheeled closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. In the kitchen's overhead lighting, I could see the sharp planes of his face more clearly, the kind of bone structure that suggested aristocratic breeding, and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. But it was his hands that caught my attention as he stopped beside the scattered papers. They were strong, unmarked by the calluses that had defined Denzel's palms, yet they gripped his wheelchair's armrests with barely contained tension. "You hired me knowing exactly who I was," I said, rising slowly from my knees. My voice carried the weight of 15 years managing difficult contractors and demanding clients. "You knew about Denzel, about the partnership, about everything." He didn't deny it. Instead, he bent forward slightly and picked up the photograph of Denzel standing beneath the excavator. Denzel at the restaurant, studying it with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Your son was supposed to meet me that Monday morning. We had a contract signing scheduled for 9. Monday, the morning Denzel died, clutching his chest in the parking lot of his apartment complex before the paramedics could reach him. You knew he was dead, and you said nothing when I walked into your house tonight. The accusation hung between us like smoke. You watched me unpack, cook your dinner, clean your kitchen, all while knowing you held the evidence that could clear my name." Samuel set the photograph on the counter with precise care. "Evidence of what, exactly? That your son was secretly planning a business partnership without consulting his co-founder? That he'd been moving company funds to prepare for an investment that never materialized?" His words hit like physical blows. Those transfers weren't embezzlement. Denzel was preparing for your partnership. Preparation that looked remarkably similar to theft, didn't it? Especially after he died and left no official explanation. Samuel's voice remained level, but something sharp gleamed in his dark eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Mills, what did you know about your son's financial arrangements in those final weeks?" The question stung because the answer revealed my own blindness. Nothing. He said he was working on something special, but he wanted to surprise me with the details. "Surprise you?" Samuel repeated the words with what might have been amusement. "And in 15 years of partnership, Denzel had never kept business secrets from you before?" I thought of all the late-night phone calls, the hushed conversations that stopped when I entered Denzel's office, the way he'd grown distant and preoccupied in those final weeks. Signs I'd rationalized as pre-birth surprise planning, or perhaps stress from Natalie's constant pressure to expand the business. "Never," I said quietly, though even as I spoke the word, doubt crept in. Samuel watched my face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading people's weaknesses. "Your son came to me 6 months ago with a proposal. Mills Construction needed capital for expansion, and he'd identified several contracts that could triple your company's revenue within 2 years. The numbers were impressive." He paused, reaching for another paper from the scattered pile. "This is Denzel's initial business plan. Have you ever seen it?" The document he handed me was thick, professionally bound, and bore Denzel's signature on every page. As I flipped through it, my confusion deepened. The financial projections were more aggressive than anything we'd ever discussed. The proposed contracts were in markets we'd never explored. The growth timeline was impossibly ambitious. "Where did this come from?" I whispered. "Your son spent months developing it. He researched markets, analyzed competitors, projected revenue streams, all without mentioning it to his business partner." Samuel's tone remained conversational, but there was something predatory in the way he watched my reaction. The question is, why? I studied the business plan's pages, recognizing Denzel's handwriting in the margins, but not understanding the vision he'd outlined. This wasn't the careful, methodical growth strategy we'd always employed. This was something bigger, riskier, more ambitious than the Denzel I knew would ever consider. "He would have discussed this with me," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Would he?" Samuel leaned back in his wheelchair. "According to his notes, Denzel was concerned that you'd resist the rapid expansion he envisioned. He felt you were too conservative, too risk-averse for the opportunities he saw. The words hit harder than Natalie's accusations ever had. Too conservative, too risk-averse, as if the caution that had kept Mills Construction stable through 2 recessions was somehow a character flaw. So he decided to circumvent me entirely. Move money, make plans, negotiate partnerships, all behind my back. Business is rarely personal, Mrs. Mills. It's about recognizing opportunities and acting decisively. Samuel gathered the scattered papers with efficient movements. Dentzel recognized an opportunity. He acted. The fact that he died before explaining his actions to you is unfortunate, but it doesn't change the essential truth. What truth? I asked, though part of me already knew what he was going to say. That your son didn't trust you to understand his vision for the future. The silence that felt heavy, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to process. I watched Samuel organize the papers back into their folder, his movements precise and purposeful. Everything about him suggested control over his environment, his information, his reactions. Even paralyzed, he radiated the kind of power that Dentzel had always admired in successful businessmen. Why didn't you complete the partnership? I asked. After Dentzel died, you could have approached Natalie, offered to honor the agreement. For the first time since I discovered the folder, Samuel's composure cracked slightly. A muscle in his jaw tightened, and his hands stilled on the papers. I met Natalie Mills exactly once. 3 days after the funeral. She was not interested in honoring Dentzel's commitments. The way he said it told me there was more to that story, but I didn't press. Instead, I found myself studying his face, trying to understand why he'd hired me if he'd already dismissed the Mills family as unworthy business partners. So you hired his mother instead, the woman too conservative and risk-averse to be trusted with his own business plans? Why? Samuel was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note I hadn't heard before, something that might have been regret. Because Dentzel spoke about you constantly during our meetings. Every conversation, every meal, every phone call included some mention of your mother's wisdom, her experience, her contributions to the company. He looked directly at me then, and I saw something unexpected in his eyes. He was planning to surprise you with the partnership, but he was also terrified of disappointing you if it failed. The revelation hit me like cold water. He was protecting me, or protecting himself from your judgment. Samuel's honesty was brutal. Dentzel admired you, Mrs. Mills, but he also felt constrained by your expectations. He wanted to prove he could be more than the careful, methodical partner you'd trained him to be. I thought of all the times I'd counseled Dentzel toward caution, all the risks I'd helped him avoid, all the conservative choices that had kept Mills Construction profitable, but small. Had my guidance been wisdom or limitation? Had my protection been love or control? And now, Natalie controls everything, I said bitterly. Natalie controls nothing. Samuel's voice turned cold. Within 6 months, Mills Construction will be bankrupt. The contracts Dentzel identified in his business plan have been awarded to competitors. The expansion opportunities he researched have been lost to more decisive players. Your daughter-in-law inherited a company, but she lacks the vision or experience to maintain it. Despite everything, Dentzel's deception, Natalie's betrayal, my current circumstances, the news of Mills Construction's impending failure hit me like a physical blow. 15 years of work, of careful building and strategic growth would die with Dentzel after all. You could save it, Samuel continued, his voice taking on a different quality. The partnership Dentzel envisioned could still work. The capital I offered him could still rescue Mills Construction from Natalie's mismanagement. I stared at him, understanding finally why he'd hired me, why he'd orchestrated this revelation, why he'd waited for me to discover the truth rather than simply explaining it. This wasn't chance or coincidence. This was calculation. "You want something," I said. "I want what Denzel promised me, a profitable partnership with an experienced construction company. The fact that his death complicated the arrangement doesn't change the fundamental opportunity. But I don't control Mills Construction anymore. Natalie owns Denzel shares." Samuel smiled then, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Natalie owns Denzel shares, but she doesn't own her mother's experience, or connections, or reputation. You built Mills Construction before Denzel was old enough to hold a hammer. You know every supplier, every subcontractor, every municipal official who matters in this region. He leaned forward slightly, and I could see the intensity that probably made him wealthy enough to own this sprawling house and hire desperate women to cook his meals. "Start over, Mrs. Mills. Take what you know, what you've learned, what you've earned through 15 years of building something from nothing. Start a new company. Let me fund it." The proposal hung in the air between us like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I could see the appeal immediately. Revenge against Natalie disguised as business opportunity. Vindication for years of careful planning and conservative growth strategies. It would be justice of a sort, watching Mills Construction fail while I built something bigger and better. But it would also be everything I'd spent my adult life avoiding. Risk, uncertainty, the kind of aggressive expansion that had terrified Denzel enough to keep it secret from me. "I'm 62 years old," I said quietly. "I'm facing criminal charges. I'm living in your house because I have nowhere else to go. I'm hardly the ideal candidate for entrepreneurial risk-taking." "You're experienced, desperate, and have nothing left to lose," Samuel countered. "In my experience, that combination produces either spectacular failure or extraordinary success. The difference is usually determination." I looked around his sterile, expensive kitchen, thinking about the life I'd built and lost. The son who died keeping secrets from me, the daughter-in-law who'd branded me a thief. Everything familiar had been stripped away, leaving me with nothing but the knowledge accumulated over decades in an industry I understood better than most people understood their own families. "What would you get out of it?" I asked. "Profit? Influence? The satisfaction of a well-executed investment strategy." His answer came too quickly, too smoothly, and perhaps the completion of a business relationship your son began but couldn't finish. There was something else, something he wasn't saying, but I couldn't identify it in the careful neutrality of his expression. Samuel Blackwood was a man who collected information and used it strategically. He'd researched Denzel, investigated Mills Construction, hired me under false pretenses, and orchestrated this revelation for reasons that went beyond simple business opportunity. But as I stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my son's secret ambitions and my own professional obsolescence, I found I didn't care about Samuel's hidden motivations. What mattered was the choice he was offering me: remain a victim of Denzel's deceptions and Natalie's greed, or become something I'd never been brave enough to be. "I'll need to think about it," I said. Samuel nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "Of course. But don't think too long, Mrs. Mills. Opportunity has a way of disappearing when people hesitate." He began wheeling toward the kitchen door, then stopped and looked back at me. "Your son believed you were too conservative to take the risks necessary for real success. Perhaps this is your chance to prove him wrong." After he left, I stood alone among the scattered papers, feeling the weight of a decision I wasn't ready to make. Outside, Santa Barbara's lights twinkled like stars, beautiful and distant. Somewhere down there, Natalie was probably celebrating her inheritance, unaware that her empire was built on sand. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window in my guest suite, watching the valley lights fade one by one as Santa Barbara settled into darkness. The folder from Samuel's drawer lay open on my lap. Denzel's business plan spread across my knees like a map to a country I'd never wanted to visit. By dawn, I had memorized every page, every projection, every ambitious timeline that had consumed my son's final months. The more I studied his work, the more I recognized the mind that had created it. Brilliant, thorough, and desperately eager to prove himself worthy of something I hadn't realized he felt he lacked: my approval. Samuel was already awake when I entered the kitchen at 6, positioned at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be financial reports spread before him. He looked up as I began preparing his morning meal, his dark eyes assessing. "You look like you didn't sleep," he observed. I was reading. I cracked eggs into a bowl with more force than necessary. Denzel's business plan is impressive. Naive in some areas, but impressive. Naive how? I whisked the eggs while considering my answer. He underestimated the capital requirements for rapid expansion. His timeline for municipal permit approvals was overly optimistic, and his projected profit margins assumed perfect execution with zero setbacks. Samuel set down his coffee cup. "You sound like you've run those calculations before." "I've been in construction for 22 years. I've seen a dozen companies crash trying to grow too fast." I poured the eggs into the heated pan, watching them immediately begin to set around the edges. Denzel's plan would have worked, but not in 18 months. More like 3 years with twice the initial investment. Interesting. Samuel's voice held a note of satisfaction, as if I'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And if you had unlimited capital and experienced management?" The question hung in the air while I folded the omelet with practiced precision. I knew what he was really asking: whether I could execute Denzel's vision better than Denzel himself could have, whether the conservative partner he'd tried to circumvent was actually the key to making his ambitious dreams reality. With proper funding and realistic timelines, Denzel's plan would revolutionize construction in this region, but it would require someone willing to risk everything on a gamble that might fail. Are you willing? I plated his breakfast, garnished it with fresh herbs from the garden outside, and set it before him. The omelet was perfect, golden, fluffy, precisely folded, a small demonstration of competence that felt suddenly significant. "I haven't decided yet." Samuel cut into the omelet with surgical precision. "While you're deciding, you might be interested to know that Natalie fired 3 more employees yesterday: your former secretary, the accounts manager, and Denzel's project foreman, all with 2 days' notice." The news hit me like ice water. Bet had worked as our secretary for 8 years. Tom had managed our accounts receivable with meticulous accuracy. And Jake had been Denzel's right hand on every major project, the kind of experienced foreman who could read blueprints like novels and manage subcontractors with the perfect balance of authority and respect. "She's destroying everything Denzel worked for," I whispered. "She's destroying everything you built," Samuel corrected. "Denzel inherited a successful company. You created it." The distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. Mills Construction had been my vision first, a small, quality-focused firm that prioritized craftsmanship over profit margins. Denzel had brought energy and ambition to our partnership, but the foundation had been mine. If I started over, I said slowly, testing the words, I'd want to hire them back. Bet, Tom, Jake, the people who actually know how to do the work. Of course you would. Samuel finished his breakfast and pushed the plate aside. Experienced employees are invaluable, particularly when they have personal motivation to see their former employer fail. The calculated coldness in his voice made me look at him more closely. He was smiling slightly, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the look of a man who collected information and used it strategically. You've been planning this for months, since Denzel died. Maybe since before Denzel died. Samuel neither confirmed nor denied the accusation. I've been watching Mills Construction's deterioration with professional interest. When Natalie made it clear she had no use for experienced partners, I recognized an opportunity. An opportunity to do what exactly? to acquire a construction company's assets, reputation, and workforce at a fraction of their market value. His honesty was brutal. Natalie will be forced to sell within 2 months. The question is whether she sells to a competitor who will dismantle everything or to someone with personal investment in preserving what matters. I stared at him, finally understanding the full scope of his manipulation. He hadn't hired me out of sympathy or even business opportunity. He'd hired me as the centerpiece of a hostile takeover.
"I said that I'm giving you a chance to reclaim your life," he said, the veins on his hands pulsing gently as he leaned back in his wheelchair. "What do you think that means?" "You want me to destroy Natalie?" I said. "I want you to save Mills Construction from Natalie. There's a difference." "Is there?" Samuel leaned back in his wheelchair, studying me with those intelligent, calculating eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Mills, when Natalie accused you of embezzlement, when she forced you from your home and threatened you with criminal charges, when she fired loyal employees and began destroying everything you'd spent 15 years building, did she show you mercy?" The question cut deep because the answer was obvious. Natalie had shown me nothing but cruelty, motivated by greed and a desire to erase any reminder that Denzel had valued someone else's opinion over hers. "No," I admitted. "Then why should you show her mercy now?" The logic was seductive, and that's what scared me. Samuel was offering me everything I'd lost: purpose, financial security, professional respect, the chance to protect the people who'd been loyal to Mills Construction. But he was also offering something darker: revenge dressed as justice, cruelty disguised as business necessity. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Samuel reached for a leather portfolio I hadn't noticed beside his chair. From it, he withdrew a thick document that looked remarkably similar to the partnership agreement Denzel had been working on. "Mills Blackwood Construction," he said, sliding the contract across the table. "You as managing partner, me as primary investor. Sufficient capital to acquire Mills Construction's assets when Natalie is forced to liquidate, plus additional funding for the expansion Denzel envisioned." I picked up the contract, scanning the key terms. The numbers were staggering, more money than Mills Construction had grossed in its best year, enough to not only acquire our old company, but transform it into something unprecedented in the region. "The timeline?" I asked. 6 weeks. Natalie will default on her major contracts by then, triggering penalty clauses that will force bankruptcy proceedings. We'll be positioned to make an immediate offer for the company's assets. "And Natalie?" Samuel's smile was razor sharp. "Natalie will discover what happens when inexperienced people try to manage enterprises they don't understand. She'll lose everything Denzel left her, exactly as she deserves." I set the contract down, carefully, my hand steadier than I had expected. The terms were generous, more than generous. Samuel was offering me the chance to rebuild my life on a scale I'd never imagined possible. But he was also asking me to orchestrate the financial destruction of Denzel's widow, regardless of how much she'd hurt me. "I need time to consider this," I said. "Of course, but not too much time." Samuel gathered his portfolio with efficient movements. "Natalie's incompetence is working in our favor, but opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." He was halfway to the kitchen door when I spoke again. "Why does this matter so much to you? You're obviously wealthy, successful, connected. You could invest in any business, partner with any entrepreneur. Why go through all this elaborate manipulation just to acquire a small construction company?" Samuel stopped, his back still turned to me. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the quiet murmur of wind through the oak trees outside. When he finally answered, his voice carried a note I hadn't heard before, something raw beneath the calculated control. Because 15 years ago, Mills Construction was awarded a contract that should have gone to Blackwood Industries. Your bid was lower, your timeline was shorter, and your reputation was better. You cost me a project that would have established my company as the premier contractor in this region. He turned his wheelchair to face me, and I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. Not just calculation or business ambition, but genuine anger that had been fermenting for over a decade. Instead of expanding into construction, I was forced to focus on other investments: real estate, technology, manufacturing, all profitable, but none of them the legacy I'd planned to build. His voice grew quieter, more intense. Do you remember the Ocean View Resort project, Mrs. Mills? The job that launched Mills Construction from a small residential firm to a major commercial contractor? I remembered it perfectly. Our first big break. The contract that had allowed us to hire a full crew and purchase serious equipment, the foundation of everything we'd built afterward. That was supposed to be mine, Samuel continued. And now I'm going to use your expertise and Denzel's vision to build the company I should have had 15 years ago. Poetic justice, don't you think? The revelation recontextualized everything. His research into Denzel, his knowledge of our business, his willingness to invest so heavily in acquiring Mills Construction. This wasn't just business opportunity. This was revenge that had been planned for 15 years, using me as the instrument of his retaliation against a company I'd helped create. So, this is about settling an old score, I said. This is about completing a business transaction that was interrupted by death. Samuel's tone returned to his usual controlled neutrality. Everything else is simply context. After he left, I sat alone with the partnership agreement, trying to separate my desire for justice from Samuel's hunger for revenge. The contract would give me everything I'd lost and more: financial security, professional respect, the chance to protect loyal employees who'd been discarded by Natalie's incompetence. But it would also make me complicit in the calculated destruction of Denzel's widow, orchestrated by a man who'd nursed a 15-year grudge against my own success. The phone rang, startling me from my brooding. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting Samuel's office or perhaps Mrs. Jackson calling about household arrangements. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't expected. Jake Morrison, Denzel's former project foreman. Mrs. Mills? Jake's voice sounded strained, exhausted. I got your number from Bet. I hope it's okay to call. Of course, Jake. How are you holding up? Not great, honestly. Natalie fired me yesterday, said she was streamlining operations and didn't need an expensive foreman anymore. His bitter laugh carried years of professional pride. 22 years in construction, and she dismissed me like I was some kind of luxury she couldn't afford. I heard about the layoffs. I'm sorry. The thing is, Mrs. Mills, she offered to hire me back at half pay as a general laborer, said if I really needed the work, I could prove my commitment by starting at the bottom again. Jake's voice grew harder. I've got a mortgage, 2 kids in college, and a wife who's been out of work since her company downsized, but I'd rather lose everything than work for that woman after what she did to you. The loyalty in his voice made my chest tight. Jake had been one of Denzel's closest work friends, but he'd also been someone I'd mentored when he was learning to read complex blueprints. His refusal to work for Natalie wasn't just professional. It was personal. Jake, I said carefully, if someone offered you a chance to start fresh, to build something bigger and better than Mills Construction ever was, would you be interested? With you running it? Hell yes. Pardon the language, but you taught me everything I know about managing a construction crew. I'd follow you anywhere, Mrs. Mills. After I hung up, I looked at Samuel's partnership agreement with new understanding. This wasn't just about my revenge against Natalie or Samuel's 15-year grudge against my success. This was about the people who'd built Mills Construction with their hands and their loyalty, who deserved better than to be discarded by someone who saw them as expendable. I picked up a pen and signed my name to the partnership agreement, feeling something cold and determined settle in my chest. Natalie had made this personal when she'd branded me a thief and destroyed everything I'd worked to build. 3 weeks into our partnership, I stood in the conference room of a downtown Santa Barbara law office, watching Natalie Mills sign away everything Denzel had left her. She wore the same black suit she'd worn to his funeral, but it hung differently on her now, looser, as if the stress of the past month had physically diminished her. "This is temporary," she said, her voice brittle as she initialed each page of the bankruptcy documents. "Once I restructure the debt, I'll rebuild everything bigger than before." Her lawyer, a tired-looking man who'd clearly delivered unwelcome news many times over the past weeks, simply nodded and continued turning pages. Across the conference table, Samuel's attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s, who commanded the room with quiet authority, made notes on a legal pad without comment. I sat beside Samuel's wheelchair, officially present as his construction consultant. Though my role had evolved far beyond advisory, over the past 3 weeks I'd systematically contacted every subcontractor, supplier, and municipal contact Mills Construction had cultivated over 15 years. Not to solicit business, not yet, but simply to reconnect, to remind the industry that Catherine Mills was still very much alive and available. The response had been overwhelming. Tom Rodriguez, who'd supplied our lumber for a decade, mentioned that Natalie had missed 3 payments and stopped returning his calls. Sandra Taylor at the permit office confided that Natalie had submitted 2 applications with critical errors, causing costly delays. Even the bank president who'd approved our original business loan expressed concern about Mills Construction's leadership transition. Everyone remembered me. More importantly, everyone trusted me in ways they'd never trusted Natalie. "The liquidation should be complete within 10 days, Samuel's lawyer was saying. "All company assets, including equipment, vehicles, client contracts, and business relationships, will be available for purchase by qualified buyers." Natalie's head snapped up. "What do you mean business relationships? Those are mine." "Business relationships aren't property, Mrs. Mills. They're based on trust and performance. If your clients and subcontractors choose to work with other contractors, that's their prerogative." I watched Natalie process this information, seeing the moment she understood that losing Mills Construction meant more than bankruptcy. It meant professional exile. In the tight-knit world of regional construction, reputation was everything, and hers was already damaged beyond repair. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at me for the first time I'd entered the room. "I know you're involved in this somehow. Denzel always said you were vindictive when people crossed you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's expression never changed, but I felt his attention sharpen. This was the moment he'd orchestrated the confrontation between the woman who'd built Mills Construction and the woman who'd destroyed it. "I'm here as Mr. Blackwood's consultant," I replied calmly. "Nothing more." "Bullshit!" Natalie's composure cracked completely. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You're gonna buy my company's assets and steal everything Denzel worked for." "Denzel worked for a company I built," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 22 years in an industry that ate the weak. "Everything he accomplished because I taught him how." The words hit Natalie like physical blows. She'd married Denzel when Mills Construction was already successful, inheriting the benefits of work she'd never done and relationships she'd never cultivated. She'd taken credit for achievements that predated her involvement and blamed failures on everyone but herself. "You bitter old woman. Denzel was embarrassed by you. He told me you were holding him back, that you were too scared and small-minded to see his potential."
The attack was calculated to wound, and it succeeded. But instead of the pain I might have felt a month ago, I experienced something colder, a crystalline clarity that cut through years of doubt and self-recrimination. If Denzel was embarrassed by me, he hid it well during the 15 years he spent learning everything he knew at my side, I said. But you're right about one thing. I was holding him back from making exactly the kinds of catastrophic mistakes you've made in 5 weeks. Natalie signed the final document with violent force, her pen nearly tearing through the paper. When she stood to leave, her movements were sharp, aggressive, like a cornered animal looking for something to attack. "You'll regret this," she said, to both Samuel and me. "Denzel loved me, and you're destroying his legacy out of jealousy." "Denzel's legacy is safe," I replied. "It's in the hands of people who actually understand what he built." After Natalie left, the lawyers spent another hour finalizing details. By 5 o'clock, Mills Blackwood Construction existed as a legal entity, capitalized with more money than I'd ever imagined controlling, and positioned to acquire everything Natalie was losing. Samuel and I rode back to his house in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. The revenge was proceeding exactly as planned, but I found myself thinking less about Natalie's destruction and more about the phone call I'd received that morning from B. "Mrs. Mills, I don't know if this is appropriate," my former secretary had said, "but I wanted you to know. 3 of our biggest clients called today asking if they knew how to reach you directly. The Hendersons want you to personally oversee their new house addition. The Oceanic Hotel Group is interested in discussing their expansion project. And that developer in Montecito, Mr. Patterson, he said he'd only work with Mills Construction if you were running it." The loyalty was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. These people weren't just offering business, they were offering validation of everything I'd built before Denzel's death. And Natalie's accusations had shattered my confidence. "You're quiet," Samuel observed as we entered his house. "I'm thinking about what comes next," I said. "Natalie is finished, but destroying her was just the first step. Now we have to prove we can actually build something better." Samuel nodded approvingly. Denzel's expansion plan, executed properly, the regional dominance he dreamed about, achieved through experience rather than reckless ambition. But as I prepared his dinner that evening, our routine unchanged despite the momentous events of the day, I realized my motivations had evolved beyond simple revenge or even business success. Somewhere in the process of reclaiming my professional identity, I'd rediscovered something I'd forgotten in the months of grief and self-doubt following Denzel's death. I was good at this. Not just competent or experienced, but genuinely gifted at the complex orchestration of personalities, regulations, budgets, and timelines that made construction projects succeed. Denzel had learned from me, but he never surpassed me. Natalie had inherited from Denzel, but she never understood what she'd been given. The phone rang as I was cleaning up. Samuel answered it in his study, and I could hear his murmur of his voice through the closed door. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. "That was my lawyer," he said. "Natalie's threatening to contest the bankruptcy, claiming she was coerced into signing under duress." The news should have worried me, but instead I felt the familiar surge of the strategic thinking that had carried me through decades of construction crisis. Can she prove coercion? No. But she can delay the asset liquidation, tie up the process in court proceedings, maybe even force a more complex dissolution that allows her to retain partial ownership. I stared at each other across his kitchen, both understanding the implications. Natalie wasn't just fighting for Mills Construction anymore. She was fighting for survival. And a desperate woman with nothing left to lose could be far more dangerous than we'd anticipated. "What do you recommend?" Samuel asked. The question thrilled me in ways I hadn't expected. He was asking for my strategic assessment, my professional judgment, my expertise. After months of being dismissed as a conservative obstacle to progress, I was being consulted as the expert I'd always been. "We accelerate the timeline," I said. "Instead of waiting for the asset liquidation to finalize, we start operating immediately.
Contact the clients, hire the employees, begin bidding on contracts. Make it clear that Mills Blackwood Construction isn't waiting for Natalie's permission to exist. Samuel smiled, and for once, it reached his eyes. Aggressive. Denzel would be surprised to see this side of his conservative mother. Denzel never saw me in a real fight, I replied. He inherited a successful business. I had to create one from nothing against competitors who thought a woman had no place in construction. Natalie's about to learn what that actually required. The next morning, I began the most intensive week of my professional life. By 7 a.m., I was on the phone with Tom Rodriguez,
arranging lumber deliveries for projects that didn't yet officially exist. By 8, I was meeting with Sandra Taylor at the permit office, ensuring our applications would receive priority processing. By 9, I was in Bet's living room, offering her a salary increase to become my executive assistant. "Mrs. Mills," Bet said, tears in her eyes, "when Natalie fired me, she said I was too old to learn new systems, that the company needed fresh perspectives. I've been thinking I was finished." "You're not finished," I assured her. "You're experienced, and experience is exactly what Mills Blackwood Construction values most." By the end of the week, I had a team. Bet handling administration, Tom managing accounts, Jake overseeing field operations. 3 of our former clients had signed preliminary agreements. The Henderson House addition was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Natalie's legal challenge proceeded as expected, but it felt increasingly irrelevant. We weren't waiting for her permission to succeed. We were simply succeeding, with or without her cooperation. Samuel observed this transformation with evident satisfaction, but I sensed something else in his attention, a recognition that I'd become something more than the instrument of his revenge. I was becoming the partner Denzel had never quite managed to be, someone who could match his strategic thinking with superior execution. "You're enjoying this," he said one evening, watching me review project schedules at his kitchen table. "I'm good at this," I corrected. "There's a difference between enjoyment and competence." But even as I said it, I knew he was right. I was enjoying the challenge, the complexity, the satisfaction of building something significant. For the first time since Denzel's death, I felt fully alive, not just surviving, but thriving. The only question was what would happen when Natalie finally understood that her fight was already lost and turned her desperation toward more personal forms of retaliation. The fire started at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Natalie had signed away her inheritance. I knew the exact time because Samuel's security system recorded everything, including the moment the flames first appeared in the storage yard where Mills Blackwood Construction kept our equipment. I stood in Samuel's kitchen, still in my nightgown, watching orange light flicker against the valley walls 12 meters away. The fire department sirens had woken me, their wailing calls echoing off the hills like some primitive alarm. But even before Samuel wheeled into the kitchen behind me, even before his phone started ringing with calls from our insurance company, I knew this wasn't an accident. "How much did we lose?" I asked, my voice steady despite the churning in my chest. Samuel ended his call and set the phone on the counter with deliberate care. 2 excavators, the crane, most of the smaller equipment. The building itself survived, but everything inside? He gestured toward the distant glow. Total loss. About $400,000 in equipment value. I nodded, already running calculations. We had insurance, but policies didn't cover project delays, client confidence, or the reputation damage that would follow. 3 major contracts depended on that equipment. The Henderson House addition was scheduled to begin tomorrow. "The investigation will take weeks," Samuel continued, "but my security consultant found evidence of accelerant. This was arson. Neither of us said Natalie's name, but we didn't need to. She disappeared from Santa Barbara 2 weeks ago after her final legal challenge had been dismissed with prejudice. Her lawyer had stopped returning calls, her apartment had been vacated, and even her closest friends claimed not to know where she'd gone. I'd assumed she'd finally accepted defeat and moved somewhere to start over.
Apparently, I'd underestimated her capacity for destruction. "She wants me to know it was her," I said, still staring at the distant flames. "This isn't random vandalism. It's a message." Samuel's reflection appeared in the window beside mine, his expression grim. "The question is, what message she intends to send next?" The answer came 18 hours later, delivered by a process server who found me reviewing insurance forms in Samuel's study. The lawsuit was comprehensive, creative, and clearly designed to cause maximum damage to both Mills Blackwood Construction and my personal reputation. Natalie was suing me for alienation of affection, claiming I deliberately undermined her marriage to Denzel by encouraging his business decisions without her knowledge. She was suing Samuel for tortious interference with her inheritance rights, alleging he'd manipulated me into destroying Mills Construction for his personal benefit. Most significantly, she was suing both of us for conspiracy to fraud, claiming the partnership between Mills Blackwood Construction was a criminal scheme to steal assets that rightfully belonged to Denzel's estate. The allegations were legally frivolous, but publicly damaging. Every local newspaper would cover the lawsuit. Every potential client would question our integrity. Every subcontractor would wonder if we were really the criminals Natalie claimed. "She's forcing us to fight in court while she attacks us everywhere else," I told Samuel after reviewing the documents. "Even if we win eventually, the damage to our reputation could destroy everything we've built." Samuel read through the lawsuit with the careful attention of someone accustomed to legal warfare. "She's also exposing herself to serious criminal charges. Arson is a felony, and filing false lawsuits can be prosecuted as perjury. Only if we can prove she set the fire," I pointed out, "and only if she's still in California when the authorities decide to act." That evening, as I prepared dinner with the mechanical precision that had sustained me through every crisis of the past 2 months, I found myself thinking about Denzel. Not the secretive, ambitious man who'd planned partnerships behind my back, but the boy I'd raised after his father died. The teenager who'd worked summers learning construction basics. The young man who trusted me enough to make him his business partner. Would he have approved of what I'd become? Would he have understood the necessity of destroying Natalie to save what we'd built together? Or would he have seen only cruelty in my systematic dismantling of his widow's life? The questions felt academic now. Denzel was dead. Natalie was desperate. And I had choices to make about the future I wanted to build from the ashes of everything we'd all lost. Samuel found me sitting at the kitchen table an hour later. The lawsuit documents spread before me like battle plans. "You're thinking about surrendering," he said. It wasn't a question, and his tone carried no judgment. After 2 months of working together, he'd learned to read my expressions with uncomfortable accuracy. "I'm thinking about the cost of winning," I corrected. "Natalie's destroyed, but she's taking us down with her. Maybe there's wisdom in walking away before she destroys us completely." Samuel maneuvered his wheelchair closer, his dark eyes reflecting the kitchen's overhead lighting. "And do what? Return to cooking my meals and pretending the past 2 months never happened?" The suggestion stung because part of me found it appealing. The simplicity of domestic routine, the absence of strategic complexity, the relief of surrendering responsibility for other people's livelihoods. I could disappear into Samuel's comfortable exile, cook his meals and tend his house, let someone else worry about construction schedules and client satisfaction. But even as I considered it, I knew I couldn't retreat. Not because of pride or stubbornness, but because of the people who'd trusted me enough to rebuild their careers around my leadership. Bet had left a secure job to work for Mills Blackwood Construction. Jake had turned down offers from 3 other contractors. Tom had restructured his entire business to prioritize our projects. They deserved better than abandonment in the face of Natalie's desperate retaliation. "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "Natalie started this war when she accused me of embezzlement and threw me out of my own company. She escalated it when she destroyed everything Denzel worked for through her incompetence, and she chose total war when she burned down our equipment yard. I gathered the lawsuit documents into a neat stack, feeling something crystalline and cold settle in my chest. I'm done being reactive. It's time to end this. Samuel leaned back, something that might have been approval flickering across his features. What do you propose? Natalie's been living on borrowed time and borrowed money since the bankruptcy. Someone's funding her legal challenges, her arson, her ability to disappear and reappear at will. I met his eyes directly. I want to know who, and I want to cut off their support.
The investigation took 3 days and cost more than I'd ever spent on private detectives. But the results were illuminating. Natalie's mysterious benefactor turned out to be her sister, Linda, a successful real estate agent in Phoenix who'd mortgage her own house to fund Natalie's war against us. More importantly, Linda was liable for board discipline for her involvement in her sister's activities. Real estate agents couldn't afford criminal associations, and Linda's support for Natalie's arson and fraud schemes put her professional license at risk. I called Linda directly, identifying myself simply as Catherine Mills from Mills Blackwood Construction. "I know who you are," Linda said, her voice tight with hostility. "You're the bitter old woman who destroyed my sister's life out of jealousy. I'm the businesswoman who's about to destroy your career if you continue funding Natalie's criminal activities," I replied calmly. "Your sister committed arson against our property and filed fraudulent lawsuits designed to damage our reputation. Those are felonies, Linda, and the money you've been sending her makes you an accessory to every crime she commits." The silence that followed was profound. "I have documentation of every transfer you've made to Natalie since she left California," I continued. "Bank records, phone logs, even receipts from the accelerant she purchased with your credit card. The district attorney would be very interested in reviewing this evidence, as would the Arizona Real Estate Commission." "You're bluffing," Linda whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "Natalie has 48 hours to withdraw her lawsuits and surrender herself to Santa Barbara police for questioning about the arson. If she doesn't, I forward everything to law enforcement in both states. Your choice, Linda. Save your sister or save yourself, but you can't do both." The call ended without pleasantries. Natalie surrendered herself 36 hours later, accompanied by a public defender who looked like she'd drawn the assignment as punishment. The withdrawal of the lawsuits followed within hours, along with a public statement acknowledging that her accusations had been unfounded and motivated by grief rather than evidence. I watched the news coverage from Samuel's living room, feeling less satisfaction than I'd expected. Natalie looked diminished on the courthouse steps, older and frailer than the woman who'd fired me from my own company just 2 months earlier. Victory should have felt sweeter. "Regrets?" Samuel asked, observing my expression. "No regrets," I said, after considering the question. "But no celebration either. She chose this path when she decided to destroy everything rather than admit she was wrong. The trials, both criminal and civil, would take months to resolve, but Natalie's war against us was finished. Mills Blackwood Construction returned to normal operations within a week, our reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the failed attacks. Clients respected our resilience, employees appreciated our loyalty, and competitors learned not to underestimate our capacity for strategic warfare. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the same spot where Mills Construction had once operated, watching Jake's crew finish the foundation for our new headquarters building. The structure would be larger than anything Denzel had ever envisioned, equipped for the regional expansion he dreamed about but never achieved. Samuel joined me at the construction site, his wheelchair navigating the rough terrain with practiced ease. "Satisfied?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. Mills Blackwood Construction employed 47 people, held contracts worth $12 million, and maintained a reputation for quality that attracted clients from 3 counties. We'd achieved everything Denzel had planned and more, using the conservative approach he thought too limiting, but satisfaction felt like the wrong word for what I experienced watching our success unfold.
This wasn't about revenge anymore, or even vindication. This was about building something that would outlast everyone who'd contributed to its creation. Something worthy of the decades I'd invested in learning how to do this work properly. I'm fulfilled, I said finally. There's a difference. Samuel nodded, understanding the distinction. And Natalie? The last report I'd received indicated she was serving 18 months in minimum security prison, her sentence reduced by cooperation with investigators. Linda had lost her real estate license, but avoided criminal charges. Denzel's name appeared in the newspapers only as context for our success, his memory gradually separating from the destruction his widow had attempted. Natalie learned what happens when you declare war on someone who understands the difference between winning battles and winning wars, I said. She's exactly where her choices led her. As I spoke, I realized that the bitter woman who'd signed Samuel's partnership agreement 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone I was still learning to recognize, a woman who'd built something significant from the ashes of everything she'd lost, who'd protected the people who'd trusted her, who'd refused to be broken by grief or defeated by cruelty. The sun was setting behind the coastal hills, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Our new headquarters building rose from its foundation like a promise of permanence, a structure that would stand long after everyone who'd contributed to its creation was gone. I thought about Denzel's letter, the one where he'd planned to tell me about his secret partnership with Samuel. He'd wanted to protect me from risk, but he'd also wanted to prove himself worthy of something he thought I wouldn't give him freely. He'd been wrong about many things, but perhaps most importantly, about this. I'd never needed him to prove his worth. I'd only needed him to trust that everything I'd taught him about building lasting things from honest work would serve him better than any shortcut or secret partnership ever could. The knowledge came too late to help Denzel, but it wasn't too late to honor what he'd tried to achieve. Mills Blackwood Construction would be his legacy as much as mine, not because he'd planned it, but because it embodied everything worthwhile he'd learned at my side. And Natalie would spend the rest of her life understanding exactly what she'd thrown away when she decided to destroy me was more important than preserving what Denzel had left her. That seemed like justice enough.